Now, the best answer that Tulsi Gabbard actually gave on the debate stage was her answer on Syria. Now, that was her best answer. It could have been better, but it was still a pretty good answer. And for some reason, this is the one that TYT decided to try to pick apart and go after Tulsi Gabbard on. They tried to criticize her on her answer on Syria and her overall position on Syria. Now, a lot of people might not remember, we first sent U.S. troops into Syria. It was a scandal in the first place because Barack Obama did not get authorization from Congress to send U.S. troops to get involved in the war. We had no approval from the UN, and we were not invited in by the Syrian government at all. So we illegally sent U.S. troops in the country. It was a scandal to begin with. We were there illegally to begin with, and we have no legal standing to be there to this day. So yeah, we shouldn't be there. In the Middle East and really anywhere in the world, the U.S. has a very long track record of overthrowing governments and doing regime change if they're not willing to bow to the demands of U.S. empire and our corporate interests. But also, if you align yourself with other governments and countries who we don't like. We did it in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. We did it in Libya with Gaddafi. We're trying to do it right now in Iran. Regime change is the driving force behind the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and the UAE's slaughter of Yemen. Shia Houthi rebels took control of the country from Abdul Salah, who was basically a puppet of Saudi Arabia. And ever since then, we've done an all-out genocide in the country just so we can install a government who's going to bend the knee and take orders from Saudi Arabia and the United States. Syria is not the exception of all of our military operations that we've done in recent history, where we're actually doing this for humanitarian reasons instead of an overt/covert regime change effort done for strategic and financial reasons. We may not be in direct armed combat with the Syrian army, and we may not be giving our troops the order to go and kill Bashar al-Assad, but we've armed and trained a lot of these jihadist groups who are aligned with ISIS and Al-Qaeda so that they can successfully overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. So this has been a bloody war where the weapons and training and logistical support have come from the United States and our allies. And the express goal of the people we're supporting is to overthrow the government. This is by definition a regime change war. That's a huge part of this Syrian conflict and a huge part of why we're involved in Syria in the first place. If anybody tells you the main reason why we're in Syria is to fight ISIS, they are ignorant, misinformed, or they're just lying to you. Because like I said over and over again, we arm ISIS. We're the reason, we're largely responsible for them. We're more responsible than almost anyone in the world for ISIS. So if you really think that the United States went and started an illegal war and illegally put our troops into Syria for humanitarian reasons like fighting ISIS, and that was the only cause, there weren't any nefarious, undisclosed motives like overthrowing the Assad government at the behest of Saudi Arabia. Like, if you think that didn't play a role in this at all, you're incredibly naive. The U.S. just wanted a military presence in Syria so that we can continue to destabilize the country, plunge it further into chaos, and hopefully a situation arises where either rebels we're supporting overthrow Assad, or there's a direct confrontation and we decide we're going to go after Assad ourselves. But either way, the U.S. wanted a presence in Syria to provoke regime change. Now, apparently TYT didn't get the memo, even though this has been one of the largest military operations that we're currently involved in for the last 7-8 years. No one let the team at the Young Turks know our main goal in Syria for the last 7-8 years has been to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. Because of this, you have hosts on the Young Turks going out and repeating mainstream media, CIA, State Department talking points on Syria, pretending like our only objective in Syria over the last few years has been to fight ISIS and to protect the Kurds from this slaughter that Turkey's trying to carry out. In this video, I have a clip of Anna Kasparian trying to argue that there's no way that the U.S. is actually trying to do regime change in Syria, and Tulsi Gabbard is dead wrong because we only have 1,000 troops in northeastern Syria. How are you going to do regime change with 1,000 troops? That was literally Anna Kasparian's argument, ignoring the fact that over years now, there have been countless stories of the U.S. and our allies arming, funding, and providing logistical support to the jihadist opposition trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. So in a stunning display of ignorance, all these hosts prove they have no idea what they're talking about on the issue of Syria, while simultaneously trying to go after Tulsi Gabbard, who has been right on this issue. So when Tulsi Gabbard says this was a regime change war to begin with, she is exactly correct. This was a covert regime change war. Now, before I get into her answer and the TYT's goofy, silly smear / criticism of Tulsi Gabbard, let me just make this very clear. Out of all 12 candidates on that debate stage and the moderators representing CNN and the New York Times, out of all of them, Tulsi Gabbard is and has been more right on Syria than anyone, including Bernie Sanders. And let me tell you why. Because yes, Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard constantly rip the Iraq war and explain how it is us going into Iraq, overthrowing the government and dispersing the generals and the leaders of Saddam's government into the Middle East so that they could form alliances with jihadists that later began groups like ISIS. That's our fault. And the spread of these radical groups throughout the Middle East, throughout Iraq and Syria and all over would not have happened if we never went into Iraq. Both of them are right on that point. And Tulsi Gabbard is focused on Syria a little bit more than Bernie Sanders, I think. I would say because she was the one who introduced, like I mentioned earlier, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, the leadership of ISIS came about because of U.S. foreign policy. But the weapons that they got also from failures in U.S. foreign policy. Weapons that they found laying around Iraq after the initial invasion. We just left millions of dollars worth of weapons laying around in military warehouses for anybody to pick up in Iraq. We're also directly and indirectly funding ISIS and other jihadist groups in Syria through Saudi Arabia, and Turkey was also doing the same, funding jihadist rebels in Syria to overthrow Assad's government. There was a time when one of the biggest headlines was a story talking about, or a report explaining how jihadist extremist rebels that the CIA were backing in Syria were fighting the other jihadist extremist rebels that the Pentagon was backing in Syria. So two rebel groups, rebels that were fighting the established Syrian government, two rebel groups that we were arming and propping up were fighting each other in Syria. So I just explained how it's been clear from the very beginning of the U.S. involvement in this conflict that we were arming jihadists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other rebels who were beheading people and doing war crimes throughout Syria in hopes that they would topple the Assad government. Back in, I believe, 2017, probably earlier than that, Tulsi Gabbard saw this was arguably the biggest problem in Syria, definitely the biggest problem that we can control in Syria. So she said, you guys want to fight ISIS? You guys want to prevent ISIS from growing this caliphate? Stop arming them. Stop arming all the terrorists that we're arming in Syria and be done with it. Fairly simple and straight to the point, but she was the only one to introduce that. And everybody's clutching their pearls and shedding their crocodile tears and pretending like they care so much about the Kurds now that Donald Trump betrayed them and Erdogan is invading Syria to slaughter them. Now everybody in the mainstream media, all the neocons, all the warmongers in both parties, they're all so outraged and it's all in defense of the Kurds. Well, Tulsi Gabbard's Stop Arming Terrorists Act would have helped the goddamn Kurds because they were on the ground fighting ISIS while we were propping them up with Saudi Arabia and Turkey. The Kurds were on the ground fighting it, and none of these people who are outraged now had anything to say about us arming ISIS back then, even though ISIS killed over 10,000 Kurdish fighters. Now everybody's worrying about, all these innocent Kurdish people. They're being slaughtered. They're dying. Where was that concern when we were arming the people who were killing them? The only people who gave a damn about that was Tulsi Gabbard when she introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. So like I said, she's been more right on this issue than everybody on that goddamn stage. So when she's asked about what's happening right now, the current situation with the Turkish invasion and the genocide, ethnic cleansing of Kurdish territories in Syria, when she's asked about that, she says that this is Donald Trump's fault. He has blood on his hands and he is responsible for the massacre that's happening in Kurdish territory right now. Yes, she was right on that. But then she also does something that I commend her for, which is she called out the mainstream media, the New York Times and CNN, for smearing her on the issue of Syria this entire time. Anytime Tulsi Gabbard's name is brought up, a Assad apologist is right there behind it. If not just they probably use the word Assad apologist more than Tulsi Gabbard's own name on mainstream media. Tulsi Gabbard has been right about U.S. involvement in Syria, about how we've been trying to do a covert and in some ways just overt regime change and overthrow the Assad government. And she has been leading the charge trying to get the U.S. out of Syria this whole time and do it in a peaceful way so that Syria and Turkey and the Kurds could avoid fighting and have a peace agreement, and we pull out in a reasonable, rational way and end our involvement in that in Syria altogether, and the U.S. supporting jihadist rebels trying to overthrow the Assad government. That was Tulsi Gabbard's main point on Syria for years, and she's been smeared. So rightfully, she points this out because that very day, CNN had their own paid analysts smearing Tulsi Gabbard, calling her an Assad apologist, calling her a Russian asset. Mind you, Tulsi Gabbard, who is a current service member, so she's a veteran. She's serving in the she's serving in the National Guard, and they're saying that she has allegiances and she's doing the bidding of foreign governments. CNN analysts, paid analysts, saying this on their network with no pushback, and they do it all the time. The New York Times, 2 days before the debate, runs a hit piece on Tulsi Gabbard with all their favorite smears, that she's an Assad apologist, that she's a Putin puppet, she's a Russian asset, all that shit. So Tulsi Gabbard, rightfully pissed off, calls out the media for their relentless smearing of anti-war voices. And she gets a round of applause, and people see that, and people give her credit for that. Because she actually had a point. She's been right about Syria, and they've smeared her about it. So yeah, she deserves to call their asses out to their face, since it's CNN and the New York Times hosting this. The main people smearing the shit out of her. So that was the second part of her answer. And again, she's fitting all this in a minute and 15 seconds. She called Trump's decision out to allow the green light this Turkish invasion. She points to the media and says they've been smearing her for having the actual correct position on Syria this entire time. And like I said, of course, TYT really not doing themselves any favors here. Go out and decide to try to attack Tulsi Gabbard on her strongest answer of the night. Watch this. It's just silly. This is just silly.
I'm glad that this topic got covered. I did not appreciate Tulsi Gabbard's answer to this question because I had no idea what she was even talking about. But with that preface, let's go to her answer.
Oh, first of all, we've got to understand the reality of the situation there, which is that the slaughter of the Kurds being done by Turkey is yet another negative consequence of the regime change war that we've been waging in Syria. Donald Trump has the blood of the Kurds on his hand, but so do many of the politicians in our country from both parties who have supported this ongoing regime change war in Syria that started in 2011, along with many in the mainstream media who have been championing and cheerleading this regime change war. Not only that, but New York Times and CNN have also smeared veterans like myself for calling for an end to this regime change war. Just 2 days ago, the New York Times put out an article saying that I'm a Russian asset and an Assad apologist and all these different smears. This morning, a CNN commentator said on national television that I'm an asset of Russia. Completely despicable. As president, I will end these regime change wars by doing two things: ending the draconian sanctions that are really a modern day siege, the likes of which we are seeing Saudi Arabia wage against Yemen, that have caused tens and thousands of Syrian civilians to die and to starve. And I would make sure that we stop supporting terrorists like Al-Qaeda in Syria, who've been the ground force in this ongoing regime change war.
So, look, just taking my own opinion out of this and focusing on strategy, mentioning how you've been attacked as an Assad asset is not gonna play well, because then people are gonna go away with that thinking like, wait, is she an asset?
It's the Nixon thing.
Yeah, it's just
you can justifiably be pissed about it.
Yeah, and
definitely.
I would be pissed about it.
But don't say it.
But don't say it, because it's only gonna hurt you. And also, this was such a layup for her, right? And what I mean by that is, she supports Kurds, but it wasn't clear in her answer. Like she said, Trump has blood on his hand, but then immediately moved on to, this is about me, I'm being smeared, everyone feel bad for me. No, you need to use this opportunity. I get it. US involvement abroad has been disastrous, but this question is very specific. The Kurds in northern Syria have fought for us. They're guarding ISIS prisoners for us, or were for us. And then after one phone call with Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, Trump decides to pull US troops out. Again, they were serving as a deterrent, and now innocent people are literally being murdered right now as we speak. Right? And it was just a bad move. This answer was a layup for her. But instead, she moved on to, I'm being smeared, and then later decided to do this weird attack on Elizabeth Warren that didn't even land. She should have focused on actually answering the question, because I think it was an opportunity for her to have a strong answer.
All right, so first things first, you gotta love the concern trolling by Anna Kasparian there. Like pretending that she cares to give Tulsi Gabbard some advice on this. And furthermore, that's just dumb advice. I mean, it's like literally almost every time her name is mentioned in mainstream media, they bring up the Assad apologist smear. In almost every segment they mention her on TYT, they bring up the Assad apologist smear. And I'm talking about specifically Anna and Emma bring this shit up. So the overwhelming majority of the voters in the Democratic primary, if they've even heard Tulsi Gabbard's name, the only thing they could probably ever remember associated with her name is that she's an Assad apologist and she's a dictator lover, and she's somehow working for the interest of Bashar al-Assad, a foreign government. They're accusing her of working for a foreign government while she's sitting in the United States Congress and she's serving in the National Guard. Like, there's so many layers of gross in that smear. So if that's all that most voters in the Democratic primary can associate with your name, why not take the time out in the Democratic primary to bring up that issue, especially when it relates to Syria. They've called her an Assad apologist because she's made the case that we shouldn't be doing this covert regime change effort in Syria. We should not be arming jihadist rebels who are fighting Bashar al-Assad and trying to overthrow his government, but at the same time beheading people and being just as barbaric as the terrorists we claim to be fighting. So that's the point that she's been making for years. And that's why everybody calls her an Assad apologist. So yes, it makes sense to bring it up in this context, because now with this situation with Turkey invading Kurdish territory, and now 10,000 ISIS fighters might be free because nobody's there to watch the prisons. It all comes back to what Tulsi Gabbard's been saying this whole time, that we should not have been trying to overthrow his government. And now this is 6 layers deep of clusterfuck because of that. And then for that position, she's been called an Assad apologist and smeared for it. So this is the perfect time to bring it up. And the concern trolling was annoying, and the advice was just bad because strategically, yes, now the people who have been hearing this about you can actually see what you have to say about it and see how the policies that you were advocating for this whole time were actually correct. And if we had done them, we would be in a better position than where we are now. she's running for president, that's a good way to make your case for why people should vote for you. And then again, I'm telling you, this just objectively, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, so I'm not voting for Tulsi Gabbard in the primary. But if she's making her case, that's the way to do it. And then the ironic part, the irony of all of this is TYT also pushes the same fucking smear, and now they're gonna act like it's bad form for Tulsi Gabbard to rebut the smears that they've been doing on their own network. Like, come on. Let's be real now. You smear the shit out of her, because I know Anna Kasparian. Every single time I've heard her bring up Tulsi Gabbard, do a segment about Tulsi Gabbard, and every one of them, of course, have been negative, but every time I've heard her talk about Tulsi Gabbard, doesn't matter what the story is, she has to find some way to bring back the Assad apologist smear. It's so, come on now. That is so fucking gross. It's not even like, they're trying to act like they're just neutral observers in this whole thing. Like, yeah, man, sure, New York Times and CNN, they smear you and call you a Putin puppet, but why'd you have to say anything about it? You do it too. You smear her the same exact way, and you're gonna actually have the audacity to say something to her when she tries to correct the record, after you and everyone else have smeared her to millions and millions of voters across the country for her anti-war position. God damn it. All right, so Anna kicks it off with this bullshit fake concern trolling about how bringing up the smear is worse than if you would have just ignored it. Okay, whatever. Then they go on and they try to make Tulsi Gabbard look petty for bringing up the smear. They said Anna brings up the fact that this is a layup because she actually supports the Kurds, but she didn't really say all the bad things that Trump has just allowed Turkey to do to the Kurds, and how he turned his back on our ally. And why does Tulsi Gabbard have to come out and repeat those very same lines that every single candidate, everyone in the mainstream media has been saying about Trump and Turkey and the Kurds? Why does she have to repeat the very same things? Everybody on the stage is going to say the same thing. Trump turned his back on the Kurds. Trump greenlight the invasion of Syria. Trump has blood on his hands. Why does she have to spend her entire answer repeating the same thing everybody else is going to say? It's not to say that it isn't what's happening to the Kurds and what's happening in Kurdish territory isn't important. Of course it's important. I talk about it on the show. I talk about shit like this on my show all the time. So yes, I know it's important. But again, this is a silly debate. The format is absurd. You have a minute to answer a serious question. Nobody can give the full context and a perfectly reasoned and thought out question or answer on Syria in a minute and 15 seconds. So Tulsi Gabbard said what she needed to say, condemned Trump, talked about how we need to stop the whole regime change effort in Syria, which is an important part that nobody else is talking about. So that's credit to Tulsi Gabbard. She brought up a aspect of this entire conflict, the origin of this entire thing that comes back to U.S. regime change effort. So she brought up something that nobody else was going to do. And then she also ties it back to how the media smears her for her anti-war position. And then TYT make it seem like Tulsi Gabbard is just being petty and she just wanted a reason to talk about herself. She wanted to make it all about Tulsi Gabbard. She wanted to be the center of attention. Oh, boo-hoo, Tulsi Gabbard's being treated so bad. That's not the point that she was trying to make. The point she's trying to make is the media, everybody smeared the shit out of her for being anti-war like they smear everybody else for being anti-war. But instead of digesting that and understanding the concept of calling out the bias, the pro-war bias in the media, instead of recognizing how important it is for a presidential candidate on a primary stage to do that, you let your bias against Tulsi Gabbard blind you and make it seem like she's just being petty and she wants sympathy. She wants everybody's sympathy because some people in the media said bad things about her. That's so fucking gross. It is so gross. Now, John Iadarola hits on this, and I'm honestly disappointed because I haven't seen him really contribute to the smears as much on the TYT main show throughout the primary. So I was disappointed to see his take on this because it was absolutely stupid and it was some shit that I would expect Anna or Emma to say.
Yeah, I think like she obviously wanted to talk about this issue. Mm-hmm. It's one, in the broader sense, it's core to her candidacy. And she wants to bring up that there have been all these op-eds attacking her. I don't see how they combine naturally. It seems like maybe she got a little bit flustered and so she switched over to something, I'm not really sure. But part of it is, like, debating is a skill. It's difficult and some people are better than others. Saying regime change war 6 times in one answer, it's like, regardless of what you think of Tulsi Gabbard, if you support her, if you don't, that's sort of weird, I think. And I think that answer could have been far smoother. I think she could have tied it to positions she holds, maybe specific things that she wants to do in regards to the Middle East or Syria specifically. And I just think, considering that she's probably been waiting for that question the whole night, it was a bit of a, like, a little bit of a fumble.
So I don't know where he was. They just played the clip back on in the middle of the segment. He was watching the debate. I don't know what he was watching. He pretends like Tulsi Gabbard is just completely ignorant on the issue of Syria, and she had nothing to say, and she just said regime change wars, we gotta end the regime change wars, and she just kept repeating it over and over again like she's a fucking idiot reading talking points off a index card. That's how he tried to portray her answer. He said, you could have said more than just end regime change war, end regime change. And then he tried to act like it was just a non sequitur and had absolutely nothing to do with the discussion on Syria. And she's just a robot. Like this is the narrative that they've been trying to push on TYT, that she's just a robot and her answer to everything is end regime change war, end regime change war, end regime change war, even if it doesn't apply to the question that's being asked. And they try to make it seem like that's the case here, that she's saying end regime change war, end regime change war, end regime change war, and that was the only thing she said. It didn't relate to what's happening in Syria at all, and it's just a pre-planned, pre-packaged answer that she gives to everything. How, like, that's such lazy bullshit, sloppy analysis. It's not that much to digest. It was 1 minute and 15 seconds long, her response. She condemned Trump like you wanted her to. She talks about how all of this is brought about because of the U.S. regime change effort. That wasn't incoherent. It wasn't Joe Biden speak that she was doing up there. It was no references to corn pop. She was very clear and coherent when she was talking about how U.S. regime change is the main reason why we're even in Syria to begin with. And then she brings it back to how the mainstream media smears anti-war voices. How much more do you want someone to put in a 1 minute and 15 second answer? That's so crazy. That is so crazy. He acts like she's just this ditzy idiot who's up there who knows nothing about Syria, but her go-to answer is end regime change war, and that's not what's happening in Syria.
I get it. U.S. foreign policy has been disastrous, and I'm not taking that correct portion of her answer away, but I do agree that it was a fumble because this is a specific conversation about what's happening to our Kurdish allies in northern Syria. This is not about a regime change war. There were 1,000 US troops there. 1,000 US troops are not going to do a regime change war. They were specifically there as a deterrent. And now that they're gone, ironically, it has started a war between the Turks and the Kurds in that area.
And I think
literally in this segment, they act like the U.S. entire role in Syria was to fight ISIS, ignoring the fact that we propped up ISIS, ignoring the fact that we were even responsible for ISIS being in Syria to begin with. They act like all the entire U.S. presence in Syria was to deter Turkey from attacking the Kurds and to fight ISIS. That's it. Ignoring the fact that we propped up all these different radical extremist jihadist rebel groups that were going after Assad and trying to overthrow the Assad government. And completely ignoring that and acting like Tulsi is a ditzy idiot who doesn't know what she's talking about. Like I said at the beginning of this video, and this is the reason why I went into such length when I was explaining Tulsi Gabbard's record on Syria. She is more right on this issue than anyone on that stage, and still TYT wants to act like she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's an idiot, and she's just reading off her script of ending regime change wars, even in an area where we're not doing regime change war. No, John, you're the idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. We are trying to do regime change in Syria. That was the whole purpose of us going in there. That was the whole purpose of us propping up jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra, all these other radical Islamist jihadist groups in Syria. Why is it necessary that Tulsi Gabbard has to look at it at this very myopic way, the very way that the media wants her to answer this question, the way that everyone else is answering this question? Oh, let's condemn Trump. He's bad. He has blood on his hands. He turned his back on the Kurds. Why does she have to answer it that way? Syria is a very broad, complex, and nuanced issue. So she wants Tulsi Gabbard to just talk about it like an idiot. Just talk about it like every other idiot who's providing their useless commentary on this issue. Just talk about this one very specific part that nobody actually really has paid any thought to before this, up until a couple of days ago. Let's talk about the Kurds. The only thing that we are allowed to talk about right now in Syria is the Kurds. Why are you talking about regime change? Like, that's how an idiot looks at foreign policy. It's broader than this one very specific fixed point of what's happening with the Kurds. It's more broad and nuanced than that. If we were not trying to do regime change, ISIS would not have gotten made the gains that they made in Syria. So how are you going to act like that isn't relevant to what's happening with the Kurds right now? That is very relevant. And she tries to act like regime change, the U.S. is doing regime change. How could we do regime change with only 1,000 troops in Syria? The U.S. isn't doing that. We're only there to defend freedom and democracy. She was literally using American exceptionalism talking points, the bullshit talking point that the U.S. is a world policeman and we're only out there doing good things for altruistic reasons, and there's never any nefarious motive behind our actions anywhere. Everything is just as it seems, and there's no broader implications. How silly. I already gave you all the examples, all the reports of us arming rebels and jihadists there. That's you think that's irrelevant just because we only have 1,000 troops there? That doesn't count as working towards regime change, arming rebels, trying to overthrow a government, literally fighting a civil war, trying to overthrow a government. That doesn't constitute regime change. Or the fact that we bombed Assad more than once. The Trump administration bombed Bashar al-Assad more than once. Are you going to really tell me to do it, or we're not trying to put pressure in the direction of regime change in Syria after we've bombed them twice, after we've armed the rebels on the ground in Syria that are fighting against Bashar al-Assad and his government? But no, she just looks at this again. She looks at it like she's a fucking idiot. Everybody right now is only talking about the Kurds, so we're only allowed to talk about the Kurds. And in this very narrow window that we're allowed to have this discussion, we have 1,000 troops in Syria, and they were defending Kurds, and that's all that there is, and we don't have to say anything else about it. But wait, that's not all those 1,000 troops were there doing anyway. So even if you wanted to make this a narrow discussion about 1,000 troops in northeastern Syria who are in Kurdish territory, acting as a buffer between a Turkish invasion and Kurdish territory, that's not all they were doing there anyway, because those 1,000 troops, they were blocking the Syrian government from getting up there. So they were blocking major roads in Syria, and the Syrian government couldn't get past there because the U.S. was doing a blockade, and they couldn't, of course they're not going to attack the U.S. military and start an all-out war with the U.S. military. So we were in there intervening with the affairs of the Syrian government by blocking off certain parts of the country and not allowing Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian army to access the northern border of their own country. So don't act like it was just black and white. We had 1,000 U.S. troops there, and they were only there to protect the Kurds. There is no possible way that we were interfering with the Syrian government. There's no possible way we were actually trying to do regime change war. There's only 1,000 troops there. Goddamn, this was such I mean, it's just par for the course with TYT, I guess. But seriously, this is just yet another story where TYT gets it so wrong on such a huge issue, it calls into question their credibility. This is one of the largest military engagements that we're involved in over the last 7 to 8 years. So what have you been reporting on this story? If you don't understand the basic fact that the United States, our main goal and objective in Syria has been to prop up the opposition, the armed opposition in Syria, to overthrow Bashar al-Assad's government, regardless of the fact that those people that we're arming and supporting and giving logistical support to are jihadists. That is a central part of the entire war or multiple wars that is going on in the U.S., especially when you want to talk about the U.S. specifically, our involvement in this. And you are the largest online news show, and you don't know what the fuck you're talking about on this issue. And more than that, So just on the issue of Syria, you have to call into question all of their reporting if they don't get that basic fact. But now it also gets into their coverage of the primary and progressive candidates, which has also been shit. Because they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to the Syrian war, they smear the most anti-regime change war candidate that we have running in the Democratic primary in recent history. They call her an Assad apologist because they don't understand Tulsi Gabbard's position is to stop the regime change war. They don't even think this is a regime change war. So they call her an Assad apologist and say she's working up on behalf of Bashar al-Assad. And they take one of the best moments of the night and use that as a reason to attack Tulsi Gabbard simply because they're so ignorant. They don't understand that she's right on the issue. And they're doing this to all their voters, to all the viewers and their whole audience. A lot of people who may not know better. And this is actually feeding into people's opinion of one of the better candidates in the primary race and making a positive of hers into a negative. So this is just bad, all around bad. TYT should be ashamed of themselves for this.